Clara Whitmore did not cry the morning Evelyn Carter held up that ring. She stood in the doorway of Blackwood Estate, the home that had swallowed 6 years of her life whole, and she smiled. A real smile. The kind that made Evelyn's triumph falter just slightly before it bloomed again into pride. "You're taking my place," Clara said, soft as rainfall. "You think that's a victory? Honey, you just walked through the door of a cage I spent 6 years trying to escape." Nobody understood those words yet. They would. If this story already has your heart beating faster, subscribe to this channel and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1817 arrived in Harrow County, Virginia, the way it always did, heavy and golden, with the smell of cut hay drifting across the ridgeline, and the sound of cicadas so loud a person could lose their own thoughts in the noise. It was the kind of summer that made everything look prosperous from the outside. Green fields, fat livestock, painted fences along the road leading to Blackwood Estate, and Clara Whitmore standing in the front yard of that estate with a single carpetbag at her feet and nothing else she was willing to claim looked prosperous too. Composed, unhurried. She'd spent 6 years learning how to look that way. Evelyn Carter came riding up the lane in a borrowed carriage. She hadn't owned a carriage before she'd gotten her hooks into Nathaniel Blackwood, but she would soon enough, and she stepped down with the particular kind of confidence that belongs to women who believe they have won something. Her dress was new. Her hair was done up in the style she'd always admired on other women. And on her left hand, catching every ray of that brutal summer sun, sat the ring. Clara recognized it immediately. Of course she did. She'd worn it for 6 years herself. "Clara." Evelyn's voice had something in it, not quite guilt, not quite gloating, but some uneasy mixture of both. I wanted to tell you myself, before you heard it from someone in town." "You're engaged," Clara said. It was not a question. "Nathaniel proposed last Tuesday." Evelyn lifted her chin a fraction. "We're to be married before the harvest. He thought it best to settle things quickly." "I imagine he did." Evelyn's eyes moved to the carpetbag at Clara's feet, then back up. Something shifted in her expression. Something that might have been pity or relief that the pity was flowing in the right direction. "You don't have to leave today. Nathaniel said you could have until the end of the week to... I'm ready now. Clara, Evelyn." Clara picked up her bag. She looked at her oldest friend. The woman she'd grown up beside shared a schoolroom bench with traded secrets with by lamplight when they were girls who still believed life was going to be generous to them. She looked at her long and steady, the way a person looks at something they are saying goodbye to for the final time. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to really hear it." Evelyn went still. "All right. Did he ever put his hands on you?" Clara asked. "Before now. Did he ever grab your arm too hard or stand too close when he was angry or say something that made you feel small and then smile like he was joking?" The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. "He's been a perfect gentleman," Evelyn said carefully. "Yes." Clara nodded once. "He always is, in front of other people." She lifted her bag and stepped past Evelyn toward the lane. "You're not taking my place, Evelyn. You're walking into the room I prayed every night to get out of. I hope to God I'm wrong about what's waiting for you in there." She walked down the lane without looking back. The cicadas sang the whole way. It hadn't always been a cage. That was the cruelest part of it, the part that took Clara the longest to admit to herself, even alone in the dark where no one could hear her. It hadn't started as a cage. It had started as something that looked a great deal like rescue. She'd been 19 when Nathaniel Blackwood first came to call on her father's property. Not the Blackwood Estate that was 30 miles east and sat on 1,200 acres with a white columned house that could be seen from the road. Her father's land was 40 acres of stubborn clay soil and a farmhouse that leaked in 3 places when it rained. Samuel Whitmore was not a man who'd been unkind to his land, but the land had been unkind back, and by the time Clara was 19, the Whitmore name in Harrow County meant respectful poverty and not much else. Nathaniel had appeared at a church social on a June Sunday. He was 40 years old, brown-haired, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a smile that he deployed the way a general deploys soldiers, with precision and with purpose. Every woman in the county over the age of 15 noticed him walk through that door. And Nathaniel Blackwood, plantation owner, county commissioner, the man whose handshake could determine whether a neighboring farmer got a fair price for his tobacco or got driven into the ground, that man had looked across the church hall and fixed his attention on Clara Whitmore. "I don't know what he sees in her," someone whispered behind Clara's shoulder that afternoon. "She's plain enough. She's young." Someone else answered quieter. "That's what he sees." Clara had pretended not to hear. She was good at that already, even at 19. Nathaniel courted her for exactly 4 months. He was everything her father called a man ought to be during those 4 months: attentive, generous, patient. He brought her mother flowers. He helped her father mend the north fence without being asked. He told Clara she was the most sensible young woman he had ever met, which she had taken as a compliment because she hadn't yet learned that some men use the word sensible the way other men use the word manageable. "He's a good man," her father said, the night Nathaniel asked for her hand. Samuel Whitmore sat at his kitchen table and couldn't quite hide the relief in his eyes. "You'll want for nothing, Clara, nothing at all." "I know," Clara said. "Your mother and I are happy for you." "I know that too." She married Nathaniel Blackwood in September of 1811 on a cool blue morning, with her mother crying happy tears in the front pew and Evelyn Carter standing beside her as maid of honor, squeezing her hand before she walked down the aisle. The whole county turned out. Nathaniel looked magnificent. Clara wore her grandmother's lace and told herself that the tightness in her chest was just nerves. The first time she understood what she'd married, she was washing dishes 3 weeks after the wedding. A neighbor's hired hand, a boy of about 17, had come to return a borrowed tool and had stayed talking with Clara at the kitchen door for perhaps 10 minutes, saying nothing of any consequence, just the ordinary pleasantries of a neighbor's errand. She'd smiled at him the way she'd smile at anyone. She'd been polite. Nathaniel had come home 2 hours later and found her still in the kitchen. She didn't remember exactly what he said first. What she remembered was the sound of his voice, low and controlled, not raised, which somehow made it worse than shouting would have been. She remembered how he stood between her and the door. She remembered that when it was over, he went out to the parlor and poured himself a glass of whiskey and called back to her to make sure supper wasn't late. She remembered standing at the sink with the water gone cold and thinking, "This is what I married." And then she thought, "Nobody will believe me." And then she thought, "I'm not sure I believe it myself." She told Evelyn. Not everything, not yet, but enough, a carefully chosen few sentences that she offered up one afternoon when the two of them were sitting on the porch of the Whitmore farmhouse, far enough from Nathaniel's land that Clara could breathe without counting the minutes. "He has a temper," she said. She kept her voice neutral, factual. Evelyn looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who is about to say something unhelpful. "All men have tempers, Clara. My daddy threw a boot at the wall every other Sunday." "It's not—" Clara stopped, tried again. "It's not just a temper." "He adores you," Evelyn said. "The whole county can see it, the way he looks at you in church. He's looking to see if I'm talking to anyone I shouldn't be." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said gently, the way a person says something they've decided to believe, "You're adjusting. Marriage is hard at first. Give it time." Clara gave it time. She gave it months. Then years. She learned the geography of Nathaniel's moods the way a sailor learns a reef, which channels were passable and which ones would tear the hull open. She learned to lower her eyes at the right moments and hold them level at other moments, because looking down too fast could mean submission, and the wrong kind of submission made him angrier. She learned which of the household servants she could speak to, and for how long. She learned that Sunday mornings, when Nathaniel needed to appear as a godly man, before the congregation, were her safest hours. She learned all of this alone because there was no one to teach her. Her mother called twice a year and remarked on how lovely the house was. Her father called once a year and remarked on how well Nathaniel was doing. Evelyn came by every few weeks and told Clara she was lucky. And Nathaniel in public, always in public, was the picture of a devoted husband. He helped her down from carriages. He brought her gifts. He told the county judge's wife that Clara was the finest woman in Virginia, and looked at Clara when he said it with an expression of such apparent tenderness that the judge's wife sighed audibly. "You are the most fortunate woman in this county," the judge's wife told Clara once, patting her hand. Clara smiled and said thank you. She was very good at smiling. The pregnancy changed things briefly in the way that a window opened in a closed room. Changes things. It let in air that wasn't there before, and for a time Clara let herself believe it would stay open. She'd known she was carrying a child by February of 1814. She kept it to herself for nearly 2 months, not out of uncertainty, but out of a superstition she couldn't entirely name, as if telling Nathaniel too soon might break the fragile thing she was hoping for. She waited for the right moment. She planned what she would say. She let herself imagine in the quiet of early mornings before the household came awake what it might mean for a man like Nathaniel to become a father. People changed when children came. She'd heard that. She'd watched it happen in other households. Maybe. She never found out. On an April evening, Nathaniel came home in a fury over something that had happened at a county meeting. Something about a property dispute. Something about a man named Alderman who had contradicted him in front of the other commissioners. Clara heard his boots on the porch and felt the familiar gathering in her chest, the instinctive silent inventory. Have I done anything? Is supper ready? Is there anything out of place? She hadn't done anything. Supper was ready. Everything was in its place. It didn't matter. She lost the baby 3 days later. The doctor who came summoned by one of the housemaids, not by Nathaniel, said these things happen sometimes. He patted her hand and told her she was young and healthy, and there would be other children. He didn't ask how she'd come to have bruises on her left side. She didn't tell him. Nathaniel sat at the foot of her bed that night for 40 minutes and said nothing and drank his whiskey, and at some point he said, "I'm sorry." And Clara looked at the ceiling and thought, "You are not. And I am done waiting for you to become someone you will never be." She didn't cry. That surprised her. She'd thought she would cry for days, but when she reached inside herself for the grief, she found something else sitting in its place, cold and quiet and unmistakably clear. This ends. She didn't know yet how. She didn't know yet when. But she knew with the same certainty with which she knew her own name that she would leave Blackwood Estate, and she would leave it on her own terms. And when she walked out the door, she would never need anything from Nathaniel Blackwood again. She started small, the way all real preparations start. She asked Mrs. Hartwell, the elderly seamstress who came to the estate twice a month to repair linens, to teach her finer stitchwork. "Just to occupy my time," she told Nathaniel, when he asked why the woman was staying longer than usual. "You've always said idle hands are a wife's worst enemy." He couldn't argue with that without arguing with himself. She practiced in the evenings when Nathaniel was out, which was often, though she'd stopped asking where. Her stitchwork progressed from competent to exceptional within a year. She watched Mrs. Hartwell's hands. She asked questions. She listened to everything the woman said about running a workroom, about pricing, about which towns had demand for fine embroidery and which didn't. She began very carefully to remove small pieces of jewelry from her possession, not all at once. Nothing dramatic. Just a brooch here and an earbob there. Things Nathaniel had given her in the first year of marriage and hadn't noticed since. She sold them through a dry goods merchant in a town 2 counties over, riding with the household maid on supply runs, doing it so quietly and so gradually that the sum she accumulated over 2 years would not have caught anyone's attention in any single transaction. She kept the money in a cloth pouch sewn into the lining of her winter coat. She didn't touch it. She didn't count it more than she needed to. She just let it sit there, that quiet, accumulated proof that she was not as trapped as Nathaniel believed. She also began in the 3rd year of this private preparation to pay attention to his business in ways he hadn't forbidden, because it had never occurred to him to forbid them. She kept the household accounts he'd handed that to her in year 2 as a matter of convenience, and she understood now how money moved through an estate like this, what the tobacco yield meant, what the contracts with the Richmond merchants were worth, what Nathaniel owed, and to whom. She knew his finances better than any man in the county suspected she did. Knowledge was not revenge. She wasn't after revenge, but knowledge was a door, and she intended to be on the other side of it. She might have left in the winter of 1816. She was close. She had enough money. She had enough skill. She had mapped in her mind every detail of what her life on the outside would look like, the town she'd go to, the work she'd do, the way she'd introduce herself to people who didn't know her as Nathaniel Blackwood's wife. And then Evelyn Carter came back into her life in a particular new way, and the plan shifted into something Clara hadn't anticipated. She'd noticed Evelyn changing over the past year, small things at first easy to dismiss. Longer visits to the estate. A new interest in the running of the house. Questions about Nathaniel's business that went slightly past what a family friend's questions needed to go. The way Evelyn watched him across the dinner table when she thought no one was looking. Clara watched all of this and felt unexpectedly something closer to grief than to anger. She'd loved Evelyn since they were 6 years old. She loved her still in the complicated, worn-down way you love someone who has failed you. Not the bright, uncomplicated love of girlhood, but something heavier and more honest. She didn't hate Evelyn for wanting what she saw in Nathaniel. She knew what Evelyn saw. She'd seen it herself once, the house, the land, the position, the man who tipped his hat to you in public and brought you flowers and told you that you were something special. She'd fallen for every bit of it. What she felt watching Evelyn was closer to sorrow than anything else. And something protective underneath the sorrow, a wish futile and stubborn, that Evelyn could somehow know without having to learn it the hard way. On a night in October of 1816, she found out just how far things had already gone. She'd come downstairs for water sometime past midnight. She heard voices in the garden. Nathaniel's low and assured Evelyn soft and a little breathless. She stood at the kitchen window without moving. She didn't need to hear all of it. She heard enough. She went back upstairs. She lay in the dark with her hands folded on her chest. She thought for a long time. Then she thought, all right, this is how it happens. She'd been afraid before that night that leaving would require a confrontation. Something explosive, something that put her at risk. She'd been afraid that Nathaniel would find a way to destroy her before she could get clear of him. He had money. He had the county's respect. He had judges and merchants and ministers in his parlor regularly, and every one of them thought him a fine, upstanding man. But Nathaniel had just handed her something better than a fight. He'd handed her a reason he would want her gone. She began from that point forward to behave like a woman who had already given up. It was the finest performance of her life. She stopped pushing back on small things she'd previously pushed back on, quietly, carefully, in ways Nathaniel had learned to expect. She became more agreeable, more withdrawn. She let him see what he wanted to see, a wife who had been worn down enough that she wasn't worth worrying about anymore. She watched him relax around her, watched his guard come down in increments. And she watched Evelyn, who started coming to the estate in Clara's presence with increasing frequency, began looking at Clara with the particular expression of a woman who feels guilty and is resolving that guilt by reminding herself that the other person is already defeated. "You've seemed tired lately," Evelyn said one afternoon in the parlor, her eyes going briefly to the window that looked out over the gardens. "Are you sleeping?" "Well enough," Clara said. She kept her hands folded in her lap, kept her voice even. "I've been thinking, actually, that Nathaniel deserves someone stronger than I've been. Someone who can be what he needs." Evelyn's gaze came back to her face, sharp and searching. "Don't say that," Evelyn said, but the words came out a half-second too late. "It's true," Clara said pleasantly. "A man like him needs a woman with more spirit than I seem to have left." She smiled, soft, a little sad. "You've always had enough spirit for 3 women, Evelyn. I've always admired that about you." The silence in the room sat between them like a third person. Clara. "It's all right," Clara said. "Really, I just want him to be happy." She watched every word land exactly where she'd aimed it. When Nathaniel told her on a Wednesday evening in June of 1817 in the parlor, with his glass of whiskey and his measured businesslike tone, that he intended to dissolve the marriage and that he'd been in contact with a lawyer in Richmond. Clara listened without expression. "I'll provide for you," he said. He had the grace to look, if not guilty, at least slightly uncomfortable. A settlement, enough to start somewhere new. "How generous," Clara said. He couldn't tell if she meant it. He watched her carefully. "I expected more reaction than this. Would you prefer tears?" "I'd prefer honesty." She looked at him for a moment. Really looked at him the way she'd stopped letting herself look at him years ago because it hurt too much, and then stopped hurting, and then became simply an act of seeing something clearly for what it was. "Honesty," she said. "All right, I'm relieved. I have been for longer than you know." She stood up. "Who is she?" He was quiet for 3 seconds. "That's not relevant." "It's Evelyn." The confirmation was in his silence. "I see." She picked up her sewing from the chair beside her and set it in her basket. "I'll be out of the house by Friday." "I said you have until—" "I know what you said." She walked to the door, stopped. "Nathaniel, a word of advice for whatever it's worth coming from me." He said nothing, but he didn't look away. "She's a better actress than she lets on," Clara said, "and she is going to want things from you that you will not want to give. And the day you try the same thing with her that you tried with me, you are going to find out that Evelyn Carter is not built the way I am." She paused. "I endured. She won't. And the whole county is going to find out why." She walked out of the parlor and up the stairs to begin packing. She didn't take much. The winter coat with the cloth pouch sewn into the lining, a few dresses, her grandmother's Bible, the small leather book where she'd been keeping notes on her stitchwork patterns for 3 years. She was ready before dawn. The morning Evelyn came riding up the lane with the ring on her finger and that complicated look on her face, the one trying to be triumphant and apologetic at the same time. Clara was already standing outside with her bag. She'd been up since 4 o'clock. She'd walked through every room of the house once, not with grief, but with the deliberate attention of a woman closing a chapter that needed to be closed. She'd stood in the kitchen where she'd spent most of her years in this house. She'd stood at the window of the room where she'd lost 2 children who never got names. She'd stood in the front hall where she'd learned to listen for the sound of boots on porch boards and calculate her odds from the weight of the step. She'd said goodbye to all of it without making a sound. And then Evelyn had arrived, ring-glittering, chin-high voice doing its best to hold steady. "You're taking my place?" Clara said after they'd stood in the morning light long enough for everything between them to become clear. "You think that's what this is?" "Clara, I never meant for—" "I'm not angry." Clara looked at her oldest friend, at the girl she'd grown up beside, the woman who had sat in church pews and at kitchen tables with her for 20 years, the woman who had told her marriage was hard and to give it time, and that Nathaniel adored her. She looked at all of that, and she let herself feel it fully, and then she let it go. "I want you to remember something. When you're in that house, when the door closes and everyone else is gone, remember what I told you this morning." Evelyn's voice was smaller now. "What did you tell me?" "I told you that what's waiting inside is not what it looks like from the road." Clara picked up her bag. "I told you I hope I'm wrong." She took 1 step down the lane, then stopped. "Take care of yourself, Evelyn. I mean that." She walked south toward the road that ran into town, into a summer morning that was already building toward heat. She did not look back at Blackwood Estate. She was 25 years old. She had $112 sewn into her coat lining, and 6 years of survival, and a set of skills that no one had thought to take from her, because no one had known to look for them. She was for the first time in 6 years entirely free. And she was for the first time in much longer than that entirely unafraid. The road stretched out ahead of her, dust and morning light and the smell of summer, and Clara Whitmore walked into it like a woman who knew exactly where she was going. The town of Millhaven sat 14 miles south of Blackwood Estate, and Clara reached it before noon. She'd walked the first 6 miles before a farmer named Gideon Pruitt pulled his wagon alongside her and asked if she needed a ride, the way people in Harrow County still asked such things in 1817. Not out of anything complicated, just because leaving a woman to walk a dirt road alone in July heat was the kind of thing a decent man didn't do. She climbed up onto the bench beside him and answered his questions, in the short, polite way that discouraged further questions, and Gideon Pruitt, who was a decent man, took the hint and drove the rest of the way in companionable silence. He let her off at this crossroads near the Millhaven dry goods store. "You all right, miss?" he asked before she stepped down. "Yes, sir," she said. "Thank you for the ride." "You got people here in town?" She thought about that for exactly 1 second. "I'm about to," she said, and stepped down into the road. The boarding house on Cutter Street was run by a widow named Ada Marsh, who had been running it for 11 years, and who had in that time developed an almost supernatural ability to assess a woman's situation from a single glance at her face. She looked at Clara standing in her doorway with her carpet bag and her straight spine, and her eyes that had that particular quality of steadiness that comes not from peace, but from having made an irrevocable decision. And she said, "$1.50 a week includes breakfast. I don't allow male visitors above the front parlor, and I don't ask questions." "That suits me perfectly," Clara said. She paid 4 weeks in advance and took the room at the back of the second floor, the one with the window that faced east and let in the morning light before anything else. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed that first night and counted what remained of her money carefully. $94 and some change. Enough to last a few months if she was careful. Not enough to build anything on without working. She opened her leather notebook, the one with the stitchwork patterns, and she looked at it for a long time without writing anything. Then she wrote at the top of a blank page in the small, precise hand she'd taught herself, because Nathaniel had once said her handwriting was childish, "What I know how to do." She filled half the page. She'd never let herself look at that list before. Not all of it at once. It felt sitting in Ada Marsh's boarding house, with the summer dark pressing in at the window, almost like meeting herself for the first time. She found work within the week. There was a dressmaker on the main street named Patience Fuller, who had more orders than her aging hands could manage, and who agreed with some skepticism, which Clara expected to let her do piecework on a trial basis. Clara brought in her first completed sample 3 days later. Patience Fuller put on her spectacles and examined the stitching for a long time without speaking. "Where'd you learn this?" she asked. "Years of practice," Clara said. "You charge for this kind of work, you could charge double my rate." "I know. I'd like to start a workroom of my own eventually. Right now I need steady income while I build toward it. I'm asking for fair wages, and I'll give you better work than you can get anywhere in this county. Patience." Fuller looked at her over the spectacles. She was 63 years old and had been in business for 30 years and had no patience for wasted time, which was perhaps why her name had always suited her so poorly. "You're Whitmore, aren't you Samuel Whitmore's daughter? You married the Blackwood man." "I did," Clara said. "I'm not his wife anymore." "I heard he's marrying Evelyn Carter." "I heard the same thing." "And you're standing here asking me for work?" "Yes, ma'am." Patience Fuller took off her spectacles and folded them. "Half again, my regular rate, not double. You prove yourself over a month and we renegotiate." "Deal." "Deal," Clara said. She shook the woman's hand and started the following Monday. The work was hard and the hours were long, and Clara loved every minute of it with a ferocity that surprised her. Not because embroidery was noble or important in the grand way of things, but because every stitch she set was a stitch she'd set by her own choice, in her own time, for her own wage, and nobody was going to come home at the end of the day and find fault with it, to see the fear move across her face. She worked at Patience Fuller's shop through the mornings, and took piecework home to Ada Marsh's boarding house in the evenings, and within her first month she had more orders than she could comfortably handle. She did not go back to Harrow County. She didn't need news from there. News traveled on its own in this part of Virginia, moving through market days and church socials and the steady gossip trade of small towns that exist close enough to each other for everyone's business to become everyone else's. She heard in October that Evelyn Carter had become Evelyn Blackwood at a harvest ceremony attended by most of the county's better families. She heard that the wedding was beautiful. She filed that piece of information away and went back to her stitching. She heard in November that Nathaniel Blackwood had been reappointed to the county commission. She filed that away too. She heard in December that Evelyn had already made changes to the house. New curtains, new furniture, a different cook. She heard this from Ada Marsh, who heard it from a woman at the market, who heard it from someone who worked for a family that socialized with the Blackwoods. And Clara listened to the whole chain of second-hand information with her hands folded on the table and her face arranged in perfect neutrality. "You don't have feelings about any of this?" Ada asked her not unkindly. "Not the ones people expect me to have," Clara said. Ada Marsh, who had been a widow for 11 years and had done her own accounting of what she felt and didn't feel about the man who had left her with a boarding house and $300 and no further instructions, nodded slowly. "That's how you know you're free of it," she said, "when the news doesn't cut anymore." "It never really cut," Clara said. "It just confirmed what I already knew." Spring came, and with it new orders and a conversation with Patience Fuller that resulted in a formal arrangement. Clara would manage the workroom entirely, take on 2 additional seamstresses, and receive 40% of the net revenue from the expanded operation. It was not what she'd have designed if she were starting from nothing. But it was a foundation, and foundations were what she was building. She hired 2 women. One was named Dora, a widow of about 35, whose husband had left her with 2 young children and a debt she was still paying down. The other was named Ruth, who was 22, and had been living in her brother's house for 2 years, since her own circumstances had required it, and who stitched with the concentrated intensity of someone who understood exactly what work meant as a form of independence. Clara paid them fairly from the first day. When Patience Fuller suggested a lower rate than Clara had quoted them, Clara said with no particular heat, "If we pay them less than their work is worth, we'll lose them to a household position within a year, and we'll spend that year training someone new. Fair wages now are cheaper than turnover." Patience Fuller thought about that for a moment and agreed. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't heroism. It was simply the application of what Clara knew about what women needed, about what fairness looked like in practice, about the connection between what a person was paid and whether they showed up the next morning with their full attention. She'd watched Nathaniel Blackwood underpay people for years and watch them drift away. She intended to run things differently. She was not yet 26. The letter from her mother arrived in April. Clara had been expecting it in the vague way you expect things you haven't thought about, but somehow know are coming. She sat with it on the bench outside Ada Marsh's kitchen door, and looked at her mother's handwriting on the outside of the envelope for a while before she opened it. Margaret Whitmore wrote the way she spoke in circles, touching on the real thing only after several orbits around it. There were 2 paragraphs about the weather, and the state of the spring planting, and the health of the neighbors' livestock before Clara's mother got to the point. "Your father and I have been thinking," it read, "that perhaps this situation has gone on long enough. A woman alone is no kind of situation for someone of your position and raising. Nathaniel has made certain arrangements for your benefit, financial arrangements that your father has been in conversation with him about, and we feel it would be in your interest to return and discuss the matter properly." Clara read it twice. Then she turned it over and wrote on the blank side in her small, precise hand, "Dear Mother, I am well. I am working. I am not returning. I have no interest in arrangements made by Nathaniel on my behalf or in behalf of anyone else. If you would like to visit me, you are welcome here. I would like to see you. Clara." She sent it the next morning and spent the rest of the day making herself not think about the fact that her parents, her father particularly, were apparently still in regular communication with Nathaniel Blackwood and apparently considered his financial arrangements more relevant to their daughter's welfare than their daughter's own assessment of her situation. She wasn't surprised. That was the worst of it. She was not surprised even slightly. Her father had looked at Nathaniel Blackwood and seen a man with 1,200 acres and a plantation and a seat on the county commission, and he had given his daughter to that man with the same calculation that he would have applied to a business transaction, and he had continued to make that calculation every day since. Clara understood it. Understanding it didn't make it hurt any less. It just meant she'd stopped waiting for anything different. Her mother did not visit. What came instead 3 weeks later was her brother Thomas. Thomas Whitmore was 21, 2 years younger than Clara, and the kind of young man who inherited a father's practical selfishness without any of the father's saving qualities of hard work. He arrived at the boarding house on a Tuesday afternoon with his hat in his hands and a prepared expression of brotherly concern that lasted approximately 4 minutes before the actual purpose of the visit surfaced. "Father thinks you're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "I'm sure he does," Clara said. "He says Blackwood has offered a fair settlement. More than fair, actually. Enough to help the family too, if you'd—" "Thomas." He stopped. "Is father in debt to Nathaniel?" she asked. Her brother's eyes moved sideways. Just briefly. Just enough. "How much?" Clara asked. "That's not the point. How much, Thomas?" He was quiet for long enough that she counted the debt by his silence. Longer than a farm debt. Long enough to matter. Long enough that Samuel Whitmore was now trying to use his daughter as a settlement instrument for the second time in her life. She felt something move through her. Not grief, not quite anger. Something older and tireder than either of those. The feeling of recognizing a pattern you'd hoped had run its course. "Tell father," she said carefully, "that I am not a piece of property he can transfer back to the man he sold me to. Tell him that I will not be returning to Blackwood Estate under any arrangement for any amount of money for any reason he can name." She looked at her brother steadily. "And tell him that if he wants to discuss this with me directly, he's welcome to come here and do so like a man who respects his daughter." Thomas shifted his weight. "You don't have to be hard about it. I'm not being hard. I'm being clear." She stood up. "I have work to get back to. You're welcome to stay for supper if you want. Ada sets a good table. Otherwise, I'll walk you out." He left without staying for supper. She stood at the window and watched him ride back down Cutter Street and let herself feel the full weight of it. Both parents had now chosen, with all information available to them, to side with the man who had broken her arm in the second year of their marriage, whose existence they were still orbiting as if he were the sun and they were just trying to stay in his warmth. She let herself feel it. She did not let herself be destroyed by it. She went back to her work. She heard from Harrow County again in June, but this time not through a letter and not through her family. One of the seamstresses she'd hired, Ruth, had a cousin who worked in the kitchen at Blackwood Estate. The cousin had come to visit Ruth on a Sunday and had sat at the kitchen table in Ada Marsh's boarding house and said to no one in particular, and everyone present, that things at the Blackwood house had shifted in the past few months. That the new Mrs. Blackwood had a spirit to her, as anyone who'd known Evelyn Carter would have predicted. That she and Nathaniel had arguments loud enough that the servants could hear them through 2 closed doors. "What kind of arguments?" Ruth asked her cousin, with the directness of someone who knew the difference between ordinary marital friction and something more serious. Ruth's cousin considered. "The kind where she says something and he goes quiet," she said. "And you know what that quiet means before it breaks." The kitchen went very still. Clara was at the work table across the room. She did not look up from her stitching, but she heard every word, and something in her chest tightened. Not with satisfaction, because there was no satisfaction in it, but with the dull recognition of exactly what she'd told Evelyn on the morning she'd walked away. The door had closed. The mask had slipped. And Evelyn, who was not built to endure, was now inside the room where Clara had spent 6 years learning to survive. She set down her work that evening and sat for a long time without doing anything at all. She thought about Evelyn at 12 years old, running barefoot in the summer field behind the Whitmore farmhouse, her hair loose, laughing at something Clara had said. She thought about Evelyn at her side in the church pew at 16, whispering something terrible and funny about the minister's hat. She thought about Evelyn squeezing her hand before she walked down the aisle in September of 1811. She thought I should have grabbed her hand back. I should have said run. She hadn't, because she hadn't known yet how bad it was going to be. And by the time she'd known, she'd been so far inside it that finding words for it felt impossible, like trying to describe to someone on dry land what it feels like to be underwater. She got up and added 2 more rows to the column in her notebook under the heading Workroom Expansion. Then she went to bed. The second pregnancy came the way the first one had, unexpectedly and at entirely the wrong time. She hadn't thought it was possible. She and Nathaniel had lived as strangers in the same house for more than 2 years before the marriage ended, and she had understood that distance to be mutual and permanent. But there had been a period in the weeks before she'd discovered Evelyn and Nathaniel in the garden, before everything had clarified into its final shape, when Nathaniel had turned toward her with something that was not tenderness exactly, but was its closest neighbor, and she had not turned away, because she had not yet given up hope in the ordinary human sense, the sense that lives below strategy and plan, and persists in the body, even when the mind has stopped listening to it. She knew she was carrying a child by the end of May. She sat with it alone for 10 days. Not from secrecy, the way she'd sat with the first pregnancy, that secrecy had been hopeful. Superstitious, the silence of a woman still believing something might change. This silence was different. This was the silence of a woman calculating, of someone asking herself the honest set of questions that had to be asked. What does this mean? What does this require? What do I do with this? She wasn't afraid exactly. She was careful. She told Ada Marsh on the 11th day. Ada listened without interrupting, which was itself a form of grace. When Clara finished, Ada folded her hands on the table and said, "What do you need?" "I need to keep working as long as I can," Clara said, "and I need to know whether you'll keep the room for me after." "Of course I'll keep the room. I can cover the rent further out if you need." "Clara." Ada put her hand over Clara's on the table. "I'll keep the room. That's not a question." She paused. "You going to tell him?" Clara considered that for a long moment. "I don't know yet. He has some legal claim. If he finds out on his own—" "I know the law," Clara said. She did. She'd read everything available to her on the subject of women's legal standing in Virginia in the year and a half since leaving Blackwood Estate, because knowing the rules of any territory she was moving through had become a survival practice. She knew what Nathaniel could claim. She knew what she could protect. "I'll make a decision before it becomes relevant." Ada nodded. "Whatever you decide, I'll back you." That was all Clara needed to hear. She worked through June without telling anyone else, letting her skirts out incrementally, relying on the fact that women who knew what to look for rarely said so uninvited. Patience Fuller, who had certainly seen enough of life to know, said nothing except one afternoon to shift Clara's heaviest work to Ruth and Dora, without explaining why. Clara noticed and said nothing, and was quietly grateful for the wordless competence of a woman who understood how to help without making a production of it. The orders kept coming. The workroom's reputation had spread further than Millhaven now to Clayfield and to Harmon's Creek, and to a handful of households in the county seat. Clara had taken on a third seamstress, a 16-year-old named Bess, whose widowed mother had come to Clara directly and asked if there was work, and who had apologized twice for asking before Clara told her to stop apologizing and asked when Bess could start. She was building something. She could feel its shape forming under her hands, the way a pattern forms the individual stitches, not yet recognizable as a whole from close up, but coherent, deliberate, unmistakably intentional from any distance. She thought sometimes in the early mornings before the boarding house came awake that this was what she'd been trying to do her whole life, without knowing it had a name. The collapse came on a Thursday in July. She'd been on her feet since 5 in the morning, an important order for a merchant family in the county seat, a deadline that couldn't move. By midday, she felt wrong in the way that the body signals things before the mind catches up. A wrongness she tried to outwork because there wasn't time, and because the order was nearly done, and because she had been ignoring her body's complaints for most of her adult life, and it had always cooperated eventually. It didn't cooperate this time. Ruth caught her before she hit the floor. She would remember that later, Ruth's hands quick and strong, and Ruth's voice saying her name sharply, and then the ceiling of the workroom which she studied with a strange detached calm, while the pain moved through her in waves that she understood immediately and completely. She lost the baby that evening. The doctor who came was a man named Holt, younger than the doctor who had come to Blackwood Estate 3 years earlier, and he was careful and professional, and he did not pat her hand and tell her these things happened sometimes. He told her what had happened medically, what she should expect physically, and what she should avoid doing for the next several weeks. He spoke to her like a person which she noticed and appreciated, with a portion of her attention that existed apart from everything else she was feeling. The rest of what she was feeling she dealt with alone. Ada Marsh brought her food. Ruth and Dora covered the workroom without being asked, without letting the order fall behind, and left a note saying the merchant's commission was done and paid, and that they'd be back in the morning. Clara lay in the narrow bed in the back room with the east-facing window and looked at the ceiling and allowed herself for the first time in a very long time to cry. Not for the marriage, not for Nathaniel, not for her parents or her brother or Evelyn or any of the wreckage of the life she'd left. She cried for the 2 children she'd never get to know, the one lost at Blackwood Estate, and now this one. She cried for them directly and honestly and without any other grief tangled up in it, because they deserved that clarity. They deserved to be grieved for themselves and not as symbols of everything else. She cried for a long time. Then she stopped because the crying was finished and she was done. She was back in the workroom within 2 weeks, which was 1 week earlier than Dr. Holt had recommended, and about what Ada Marsh had predicted. "I told him a week and a half," Ada said when Clara came downstairs on that Monday morning. "And Patience Fuller said 10 days, and Ruth said you'd be back the day after tomorrow from when you left, which would have been 9 days, so we all owe each other something, I suppose." "I'm sorry I worried you," Clara said. "We weren't worried," Ada said. "We were taking bets." Clara sat down at the kitchen table and accepted a cup of coffee and let herself be surrounded for a moment by the ordinary morning sounds of the boarding house, the creak of the floor above the clatter of pots, the voices of the other women coming down the stairs. She let it settle around her like something solid. She was 26 years old. She had lost 2 children and a marriage, and her parents' loyalty, and her best friend, and the 6 years between 19 and 25. She had built a workroom and a wage, and a room of her own, and the beginning of a reputation worth having. And somewhere in Harrow County, Ruth's cousin had said Evelyn Blackwood was learning what it cost to step through a door that looked like an entrance, but was actually a trap. Clara did not feel triumphant about that. She felt something more complicated, a deep and tired sadness for the version of Evelyn who had been her friend, mixed with the clear-eyed knowledge that she had tried to warn her and had not been heard, and that there was nothing more she could have done. But she thought, stirring her coffee in Ada Marsh's kitchen on that Monday morning, that something was coming. Something that had been building since long before Clara walked out of Blackwood Estate with her coat and her carpet bag and her $112. Something that Nathaniel Blackwood had been building toward with every door he'd closed behind every woman who'd trusted him. She thought, "It cannot hold much longer." She thought, "And when it breaks, I intend to be standing on my own ground." She went to the workroom and started work on the next order. The news came on a Wednesday, the way bad news usually did, not dramatically, not with any warning, just arriving in the middle of an ordinary morning, like a stone dropped into still water. Ruth's cousin had stopped coming by after July. Clara had noticed but hadn't pressed. Some people pulled back when things got uncomfortable, and a kitchen servant at Blackwood Estate had good reason to stay quiet when things inside that house were shifting in ways that made everyone nervous. Clara understood. She filed the silence away the same way she filed everything, as information rather than insult. So when Ruth came into the workroom on that Wednesday in August of 1818 and stood in the doorway without speaking, Clara looked up from her stitching and knew immediately that something had changed. "Say it straight," Clara said. Ruth crossed her arms over her chest, the way she did when she was holding something difficult. "My cousin sent word. She's leaving her position at the Blackwood house." She paused. She said she can't stay. She said things have gotten bad enough that she doesn't feel safe being in that house anymore. The workroom went quiet. Dora set down her needle. Bess kept her eyes on her work, but her hands had stopped moving. "How bad?" Clara asked. Ruth's jaw tightened. She said Mrs. Blackwood Evelyn came down to breakfast 2 weeks ago with her arm in a sling. Said she'd fallen on the stairs. My cousin said there weren't nothing wrong with those stairs that morning, and there hadn't been nothing wrong with them the night before. Clara set down her own work. She looked at her hands for a moment, both of them open on the table. She say anything else? She said the doctor from Harrow County came twice in 3 months. Different reasons each time. Ruth's voice was carefully even. She said the servants talk, but nobody talks to anyone outside the house because Mr. Blackwood made it real clear what happens to people who carry his business into town. The room held its silence for another beat. "Is your cousin all right?" Clara asked. Ruth blinked like she hadn't expected that question first. "Yes. She's got family in Clayfield. She'll be fine." "Good." Clara looked back at her hands. "Tell her she made the right call." She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the back room with the east window open, because August in Virginia was not a month that forgave closed windows, and she listened to the night sounds of Cutter Street and tried to keep her thinking ordered. She was not guilty for what was happening to Evelyn. She knew that. She had warned Evelyn with the plainest words available to her on the morning she'd walked away from Blackwood Estate, and Evelyn had heard those words and made her own choice, and the consequences of that choice were not Clara's responsibility to carry. She knew all of that. She also knew that Evelyn had once squeezed her hand before she walked down an aisle and into the worst 6 years of her life, and that the two of them had been each other's closest companion through childhood and girlhood, and that knowing someone is making a catastrophic mistake and being unable to stop them is its own kind of grief. One that doesn't have a clean name, but sits heavy in the chest at 2 in the morning regardless. She got up before dawn and made herself useful, which was her consistent response to things she couldn't control. The workroom kept growing. By the fall of 1818, Clara had 4 seamstresses working under her and had outgrown the space behind Patience Fuller's shop. Patience had seen it coming before Clara said anything. The older woman had a talent for reading what her numbers meant before the numbers had finished arriving, which was perhaps what 30 years in business produced in a person, and she had raised the question herself one September afternoon while they were going over the order book. "You need a building?" Patience said. "I need capital first," Clara said. "I'll back you." Clara looked up. "Patience." "Not as charity," Patience said sharply in the tone she used when she anticipated being argued with. "As investment. You've tripled my revenue in a year and a half, and you've done it without a single complaint from a customer, which is a feat I have not managed consistently in 30 years. I'll put up the lease on the building on Merchant Street. It's been empty since the chandler moved, and we'll work out the arrangement properly. 50-50 on the expanded operation, with the understanding that you're running it, and I'm sleeping at night." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I'm 64 years old and I have no children, and I have worked every day of my adult life, and I would like to leave something behind me that was worth something," Patience said. "And because you're going to do this with or without me, and I'd rather be part of it." She folded her hands. "Do we have a deal?" Clara thought about that for exactly as long as it deserved. "We have a deal," she said. They shook hands across the order book, and Clara walked home that evening feeling the specific lightness of a plan that had just become a reality. The building on Merchant Street was smaller than she'd imagined, and larger than she'd hoped, which turned out to be exactly the right size. She spent 3 weeks cleaning it, repairing what needed repairing, arranging the workroom layout, with the methodical attention she gave. Everything Lightsource's workflow, the distance between stations, the small details that determined whether women spent their working hours comfortable and productive or fighting their environment. She'd worked in enough spaces that fought their occupants to know the difference mattered. She hired a 5th seamstress and then a 6th. She started taking apprentices, younger women, some of them barely 16, who came with no skills and considerable need, and left after 6 months with both a trade and a wage history they could point to. She paid a fair training stipend from the first day because the alternative was unpaid labor, and she'd seen enough of what unpaid labor did to people to have no appetite for it. Dora brought in her 2 children to the workroom on days when her regular minding arrangements fell through, and Clara made no comment about it. Ruth's younger sister joined the operation in November. Bess, who had arrived at 16 without a word of confidence about her own ability, was by December running quality checks on the finished work with an eye so reliable that Clara trusted her over her own judgment on a difficult piece. This was the thing nobody had warned Clara about. Not about this part. She'd been warned by her father that women couldn't run things. She'd been warned by Nathaniel that she was suited for domestic management and nothing larger. She'd been told in a dozen subtle and unsubtle ways throughout her life that her competence had a ceiling. What nobody had warned her about was how it felt to watch other women discover that theirs didn't. It was the finest thing she had ever been part of. Finer than anything she'd hoped for when she was walking down that dirt road in July with her coat and her carpet bag and her $112. She hadn't imagined this specific shape. She'd imagined freedom, independence, sufficiency. She hadn't imagined this daily gathering of women into a space where their work was valued and their intelligence was assumed, and nobody asked them to be smaller than they were. She let herself feel glad about it, which was not something she'd had much practice at. The letter from Harrow County arrived in January of 1819, and it was not from her mother and not from her brother. It was from the county judge's clerk, a formal dry document, informing Mrs. Clara Whitmore, formerly of Blackwood Estate, that a legal proceeding concerning the dissolution of her marriage to Mr. Nathaniel Blackwood had raised certain questions about the terms of the original agreement, and that her presence at the county clerk's office would be appreciated at her earliest convenience. She read it twice. Then she read it again. She showed it to Ada Marsh, who read it and said, "What do you make of that?" "I think Nathaniel is trying to adjust the settlement," Clara said, "or cancel it entirely." "Can he do that?" "He can try." Clara set the letter on the kitchen table. "What he can't do is make me go away by burying me in paperwork. I've been reading Virginia property law for 18 months, and I know what I'm entitled to. And I'm not above finding someone who can argue it in a court of law." "You know a lawyer." "Not yet," Clara said, "but I'm about to." The lawyer's name was Edmund Graves, and he was not anyone's idea of an impressive figure. On first meeting, a thin, nearsighted man of about 50, who kept his office above the hardware store on Mill Street, and who had a habit of reading documents while people were still talking to him. Clara had asked Patience Fuller, who she trusted, and Patience had said Edmund Graves without hesitation and with a finality that discouraged follow-up questions. Clara sat across from him the following afternoon and watched him read the letter from the county clerk's office with the focused attention of a man who was genuinely interested in what he was looking at. "This is about the financial settlement," he said without looking up. "That's my read," Clara said. "Blackwood's claiming the original terms were agreed under misrepresentation." He looked up now. "What misrepresentation?" "None that I'm aware of," Clara said. "But I suspect he's been advised that challenging the settlement is cheaper than honoring it, given that I'm a woman living in a boarding house in another county and might simply go away if pressed." Edmund Graves looked at her for a moment. "Will you—" "No," Clara said. "Good." He set the letter down. "What do you know about his current financial situation?" "More than he'd be comfortable with," Clara said. And then she opened her leather notebook, the one that had begun as a record of stitchwork patterns and had gradually become something else entirely. And she showed Edmund Graves 14 months of careful, precise, impeccably organized notes on Nathaniel Blackwood's business affairs, gathered from the household accounts she'd managed, the conversations she'd listened to, the documents that had passed through a house where she'd been invisible enough to read freely. Edmund Graves was quiet for a long time. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said finally. "Yes. I'm going to need you to start from the beginning." She started from the beginning. It took 2 hours sitting in Edmund Graves's office above the hardware store, with the winter light coming through the window and the smell of sawdust drifting up from below. She told him about the household accounts and what they showed about Nathaniel's tobacco contracts and the discrepancies she'd noticed between the amounts invoiced to the Richmond merchants and the amounts recorded in the household ledger. She told him about the conversations she'd overheard through 2 closed doors over 6 years' dates, named Substance. She told him about her father's debt to Nathaniel and the conversation with her brother Thomas in the spring. She told him about the pattern of isolation and control laid out in the sequential, precise language of a woman who had spent years organizing information because organization had been her only available tool. She did not tell him about the injuries, not yet. She wasn't ready to put that into formal testimony, and she wasn't sure she needed to, not for the immediate question of the settlement. But she filed the decision away as something that might change. Edmund Graves made notes throughout. He was not a man who expressed admiration openly, but at some point in the second hour, he stopped asking clarifying questions and simply let her speak, which was its own form of professional recognition. When she finished, he set down his pen. "The settlement stands," he said. "If he pushes this to a formal proceeding, which I doubt he will. Once I write to his counsel, the materials you've given me today will make that proceeding very uncomfortable for him." He paused. "You understand that some of what you've just told me may become relevant in other contexts." "I understand," Clara said. "You're prepared for that." She thought about Evelyn, 130 miles north, living in the house where Clara had spent 6 years learning to survive. She thought about Ruth's cousin and the arm in the sling, and the doctor who came twice in 3 months. She thought about all the women she hadn't heard about because they hadn't been well connected enough for the news to travel. "I'm prepared for whatever needs to happen," she said. Edmund Graves nodded. "All right, I'll send the letter this week." The response from Nathaniel's counsel came in February, and it dropped the challenge to the settlement entirely. There was a single paragraph of legal language that translated in plain English to, "We have been advised that this line of inquiry is unproductive, and we are withdrawing it." Edmund sent Clara a brief note, saying that he thought that would be the end of it, unless Nathaniel was considerably less intelligent than Edmund's assessment of the situation suggested. Clara read the note and felt the satisfaction of it cleanly without guilt. She'd earned that satisfaction with 18 months of careful work and 6 years of careful survival, and she did not minimize it by calling it something less than what it was. She went back to the workroom and told no one except Ada Marsh, who said, "Good," with the flat, emphatic certainty of a woman who had been waiting for exactly that word. Spring came again, and with it something Clara hadn't anticipated. She'd been in Millhaven for nearly 2 years by March of 1819. She was known there now, not famous. Nothing like that, just known in the specific way that people in small towns know someone who has been present and consistent and useful. The women who worked for her knew her. Their families knew her. The merchant families, whose orders she filled, knew her. Patience Fuller, who was 65 now, and talked more openly about her health than she had a year ago, introduced her to people as "my partner," a word that Clara noticed and treasured with more feeling than she showed. A man named James Calloway came into the workroom on a March morning to pick up an order for his wife, and stayed 20 minutes longer than he needed to, talking about nothing in particular, and left having accomplished the actual purpose of the visit, which was to look at Clara Whitmore long enough to form an opinion. He came back the following week with a second smaller order that could easily have been sent with a servant, and Clara, who had gotten very good at reading the shape of what people were doing, understood that the order was a pretext. She was not entirely opposed to the pretext. James Calloway was 34, a widower, with a small daughter named Anna, a modest but solvent farm north of Millhaven, and the kind of quiet, considered manner that suggested he'd spent enough time in his own company to know what he thought without needing anyone to confirm it. He was not a dramatic man. He was not a man who deployed his smile with military precision. He was simply a man who showed up twice to a workroom with reasonable excuses and kept his eyes level when he talked to her. Clara did not tell herself stories about it. She'd gotten out of the habit of telling herself stories the soft, wishful kind, and she didn't intend to start again. But she noticed him, and she allowed herself to notice him, and that itself was something she hadn't done in a very long time. He came back a third time in April, and this time he didn't bring an order. He just came. He stood at the counter and said, "I was wondering, Mrs. Whitmore, if you'd be willing to take a walk with me on Sunday afternoon." The workroom behind Clara went exceptionally quiet. She kept her own face steady. "A walk?" she said. "Down by the creek. It's a reasonable hour and a public road. Nothing improper." He held her gaze without flinching. "I just think I'd like to talk to you somewhere that isn't a workroom, if you're of a mind." She thought about it for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to be honest with herself about what she felt, short enough not to be unfair to him. "Sunday afternoon," she said. 2:00. He nodded and picked up his hat and left. Bess at the back table let out a breath so carefully that it was clearly the breath she'd been holding throughout the entire exchange. Clara turned around and looked at her workroom. 4 women, all of them studiously failing to look at anything in particular, and said, "The Henderson order isn't going to finish itself," which produced a rapid and unconvincing resumption of activity that she privately found very funny. Here, the Sunday walk led to a second one, and then a third, and by May they were something that Millhaven had started to have opinions about, which was inevitable in a town this size, and which Clara had anticipated and decided she could tolerate. James Calloway was careful with her. Not cautious, the way a man is cautious when he's afraid cautious. The way a person is cautious when they understand that the thing they're handling is both valuable and not entirely recovered, and they don't want to be the one to damage it further. He asked her questions and listened to the answers. He talked about his daughter Anna, 6 years old, serious, obsessed with horses, with the particular combination of exhaustion and helpless love that fathers of small children tend to produce when they forget they're trying to make a good impression. He told her about his wife, who had died of fever 2 years prior, in the plain, honest way of a man who has done his grieving and is not looking to perform it for anyone, which Clara respected enormously. She told him some things. Not everything, not yet, but more than she'd told most people, which she was aware of and was making a deliberate choice about. She told him that her marriage had been difficult. She told him that she had left it by her own decision. She told him that she was not in any particular hurry about anything, and that she expected the same consideration from any person she spent time with. "That seems reasonable," he said. "It is reasonable. I agree that it is." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not in a hurry either. I'm also not going anywhere." She thought about Nathaniel, who had been attentive and careful and patient for exactly 4 months, and then closed the door. She thought about the difference between patience as a strategy and patience as a character. She thought about James Calloway, who had come into a workroom 3 times before asking her to walk with him, and who had not once looked at her as if she were something to be acquired. She thought, "I am not going to decide anything based on what has come before. That is not fair to either of us." So she walked with him on Sundays and let it be what it was, new and quiet and possible. It was on a Sunday in June that she saw Evelyn Blackwood for the first time in 2 years. She hadn't expected it. She'd been walking back from the creek alone. James had gone home early to deal with something on the farm, and Clara had stayed a while longer because the afternoon was pleasant, and she'd been thinking about the Henderson Commission and found water helpful for thinking. She came up from the creek path onto the main road and nearly walked directly into a woman standing at the edge of the road beside a wagon. And she had exactly 3 seconds of not recognizing her before the recognition arrived like a physical impact. Evelyn looked 20 years older. That was the first thought, and it arrived with a wave of something so complicated that Clara couldn't have named it if she'd been given an hour to try. She looked at her oldest friend, at the woman who had stood beside her at her wedding and told her marriage was hard, and given her husband a ring, and what she saw was a woman who had been carved down. Not just tired, not just thinner. Something essential had been removed, the way you can look at a person who has been ill for a long time and see that the illness has taken something specific, something that doesn't come back easily. Evelyn's eyes met hers, and they both stopped completely still. Neither of them spoke for what felt like a very long time. Then Evelyn said, "Clara," in a voice that had almost nothing in it. "Evelyn," Clara said, I didn't think you were in Millhaven. I'm just passing through. I'm going to my aunt's in Clayfield." She spoke quickly, too quickly, the words running together in the way of someone who is filling silence to keep themselves from falling through it. I'm only passing through." Clara looked at her. She looked at Evelyn's left hand, which had the ring on it still, but held it slightly away from her body in the unconscious way of someone whose hand hurts. She looked at the set of Evelyn's shoulders. "Are you safe right now?" Clara asked. "Today, I mean. This moment." Evelyn's mouth opened and closed. "I'm going to Clayfield." That didn't answer my question. A sound came out of Evelyn, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, something between the two that had no clean name. She pressed her free hand flat against her mouth and held it there until whatever was rising had been pushed back down. "I told him I was visiting my aunt," Evelyn said when she could speak again. "He doesn't know, he thinks it's an ordinary visit." She looked at Clara with an expression that Clara recognized from the inside, the specific look of a woman calculating everything in real time, every word, every implication, every possible consequence of what she might say next. "I needed to get out of the house for a few days." "Do you want to come in?" Clara said. "Ada Marsh's boarding house is 2 streets up. She keeps a good table." Evelyn looked at her for a moment with something that might have been disbelief. "After everything?" "I'm not keeping a ledger," Clara said. "I'm asking if you want to come in." Evelyn Blackwood, who had taken Clara's ring and Clara's place, and walked through the door Clara had warned her about, put her free hand over her eyes and stood in the middle of the road and breathed very carefully for about 10 seconds. "Yes," she said finally. "I'd like to come in." They sat in Ada Marsh's kitchen, the 3 of them, because Ada had taken one look at Evelyn and put the kettle on without saying a word, which was the kind of grace that only certain people had. Evelyn drank her tea and looked at her hands and didn't say anything for a long time. Clara didn't push. She knew this particular silence, the one that comes when you're trying to find a place to begin on something that has no clean beginning. Finally, Evelyn said, "You told me." "I told you," Clara agreed. "I thought—" She stopped. "I thought you were bitter. I thought you were saying it because you were hurting and you wanted me to hurt too." She looked up. Her eyes were very clear, which was the strange thing. After everything, her eyes were very clear. "I know what that says about me." "It says you were a person who wanted something badly enough to explain away the evidence," Clara said. "That's not unusual. I did the same thing for longer than I should have. You warned me the day I came with the ring. You could have been cruel about it and you weren't. Being cruel wasn't going to stop you." Evelyn was quiet. "No," she said. "It wasn't." She set down her cup. "I didn't fall on the stairs." "I know. I don't know what I'm going to do." The admission came out stripped of everything, just the fact of it, bare and honest. "I don't have money of my own. I don't have a trade. I'm not you, Clara. I don't know how to do what you did." Clara looked at her oldest friend. She looked at what 6 years of one man's hands could do to a person. She looked at the woman who had failed her and been failed by her and had been her closest companion for 20 years before either of them understood what any of that meant. "You don't need to be me," Clara said. "You need to get out and then you need to figure out the rest from the outside, because you cannot think clearly about what's possible from inside that house. I know because I spent 6 years trying." She held Evelyn's gaze. "But first, you need to tell someone in a position to do something about it what is actually happening in that house. Not what you've been saying, what's actually been happening." Evelyn's breath went unsteady. "He'll destroy me. He'll tell people—" "Evelyn." Clara leaned forward. "He already is who he is. The only question is whether anyone official knows it yet." The kitchen was very quiet. Ada Marsh at the stove did not turn around. "Edmund Graves," Clara said. He's a lawyer on Mill Street. He's not afraid of Nathaniel Blackwood, and he knows things that will make Nathaniel very reluctant to pursue any kind of public fight." She paused. "You're not doing this alone. But you have to decide to do it." Evelyn looked at the table for a long time. Then she looked up at Clara and said, "I should have listened to you on the road." "You should have," Clara said. "But you're here now." It wasn't forgiveness, not in the clean, complete sense that stories prefer. It was something more real than that. Two women in a kitchen in Millhaven in the summer of 1819, each carrying everything she'd been through, figuring out what came next, from wherever they happened to be standing. Outside on Cutter Street, the afternoon was going gold. Inside, Ada Marsh set a fresh pot on the table and sat down with them. And Clara Whitmore, who had spent 6 years invisible in a house that tried to consume her, and 2 years building something worth having out of 14 months of careful preparation and $112, and a leather notebook full of stitchwork patterns and business notes and names she intended to use when the time came. Clara sat across from the woman who had taken her place and told her, "You're not doing this alone," because she knew better than most people that no one should have to. Evelyn stayed 3 days. She slept in the second spare room at Ada Marsh's boarding house and ate at the common table and said very little to anyone except Clara, and even with Clara, she spoke mostly in the practical, stripped-down language of a woman who had packed away everything non-essential in order to function. She ate, she slept, she sat in the workroom in the afternoons and watched the seamstresses work without speaking, and Clara let her sit there because she recognized what it was, the specific silence of a person reminding herself that there was a world outside the one she'd been living in. On the second evening, Clara brought her to Edmund Graves. She'd sent word ahead. Edmund was waiting in his office with the lamp lit and his notebook open, and he greeted Evelyn with the same level, undramatic courtesy he extended to everyone, which was exactly what Evelyn needed. Not sympathy, not pity. Just a man who looked at her like she was a person with information worth hearing. Evelyn talked for an hour and a half. Clara sat in the corner chair and said nothing. This was Evelyn's testimony to give, not hers to shape. She'd already given Edmund everything she had. What Evelyn carried was different. It was current, it was specific, and it came from inside the house at a time when Nathaniel Blackwood was not the man Clara had left, but the man he'd had 2 more years to become, which was a man who apparently believed himself completely beyond consequence. Edmund asked careful questions. He wrote everything down. When Evelyn mentioned the doctor's visits, he asked for the doctor's name and wrote that down too. When she mentioned specific dates, she remembered them with the precision of someone who had survived by tracking patterns. He wrote those down as well. At the end, he set his pen aside and looked at Evelyn steadily. "What do you want to happen, Mrs. Blackwood?" Evelyn's hands were folded tight in her lap. "I want to get out. Beyond that." She was quiet for a long moment. Clara watched her working through it, the same calculation Clara had made herself, the one that asked what the difference was between surviving and actually demanding accountability for what had been done. "I want people to know what he is," Evelyn said finally. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't waver. "I'm tired of being the only one who knows. I'm tired of watching him walk into church on Sunday and having the judge's wife tell me how fortunate I am." Edmund nodded like that was the answer he'd expected. "Then we have work to do," he said. Evelyn left for Clayfield on the 3rd morning as originally planned. She couldn't go back to Harrow County yet, not until there was something concrete enough to protect her, a legal framework solid enough that Nathaniel couldn't simply characterize her departure as abandonment and use it to strip her of whatever the marriage settlement might provide. Edmund had been clear on that point, and Evelyn had listened with the focused attention of a woman who had finally decided to be strategic instead of just surviving. "You'll hear from me within the month," Edmund told her before she left. "Don't do anything sudden. Don't communicate anything to him that suggests you've spoken to counsel. Go to your aunt's, come home when you said you'd come home, and be exactly what he expects you to be for a little while longer." Evelyn's expression at that, the specific look of a woman being asked to perform normalcy inside a situation that was anything but, was something Clara recognized from the inside. It was the look of someone who'd done it before and hated that they were still so good at it. "I can do that," Evelyn said. "I know you can," Edmund said. Clara walked her out to the wagon. They stood in the early morning with August heat already building, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I keep thinking I should apologize more," Evelyn said. "You apologized enough," Clara said. "Save your energy for what's coming." Evelyn looked at her with those clear eyes, clearer than they'd been 2 days ago, which was something even if they were still carrying more than they should. "Are you going to be all right, with all of this me being involved?" "I've been involved since before you got here," Clara said. "I've got plenty of documentation and a lawyer who isn't afraid of him, and a business that doesn't depend on anyone's approval in Harrow County." She held Evelyn's gaze. "I'm fine. You just focus on getting yourself through the next few weeks." Evelyn climbed up onto the wagon. She picked up the reins and then stopped and looked down at Clara. "That morning," she said, "when I came with the ring, you were already packed." "Yes, you were already ready to go." "I'd been ready for 2 years." Evelyn absorbed that. "I was so certain you were broken," she said. "I was so certain he'd crushed you. And I thought that meant there was room for someone who wasn't going to be crushed." Her voice was very even, delivering the truth of herself without self-protection. "I was wrong about all of it." "You were wrong about what you saw," Clara said. "The broken part wasn't real. The rest you couldn't have known without living it." "I should have believed you." "Yes," Clara said simply. "You should have." She stepped back from the wagon. "Take care on the road. Right when you get to Clayfield." Evelyn Blackwood drove north out of Millhaven, and Clara stood on Cutter Street and watched her go and let herself feel the full complicated weight of 20 years of friendship distilled into 3 days in a boarding house kitchen. Then she turned around and went back to work because the Henderson order still wasn't done, and she had a new commission from a family in the county seat that needed her full attention. The month Edmund had projected stretched into 6 weeks, then 8. Clara was not surprised. Legal proceedings moved at the pace that legal proceedings moved, which was the pace of a river in drought, steady, determined, and considerably slower than anything happening on the banks. She checked in with Edmund every 2 weeks, not to press him, but to stay current. Edmund seemed to appreciate the approach. He said once in the dry tone he used for everything that most clients either disappeared entirely or came by daily, and that she had so far avoided both failure modes. "What's actually happening?" she asked him on a Wednesday in late September. "Quite a lot," he said. He set down the document he was reading. "Dr. Holt, the physician who treated Mrs. Blackwood in March, is willing to testify to the nature of the injuries he treated and the explanation given, which he has stated on the record he did not find consistent with the reported cause." Clara kept her breathing even. "That's significant. Considerably. We also have testimony from 2 former household servants who left Blackwood's employ in the past year, both of whom are willing to state what they observed during their time there. And—" Edmund paused in the way that meant what followed was the most important thing. "I've been in contact with a colleague in Richmond who informs me that Blackwood's tobacco contracts with 2 of the major Richmond merchants have come under scrutiny. There appear to be discrepancies between the amounts recorded in his business ledger and the amounts actually paid." Clara went still. "What kind of discrepancies?" "The kind that suggest the ledger has been altered, retroactively." Edmund looked at her. "Your notes from the household accounts, the ones you brought me in January. They're consistent with the merchant's records. They're not consistent with the current version of Blackwood's ledger." The silence in the office was very complete. "He changed the ledger," Clara said. "It appears so, after the fact and not particularly carefully." Edmund's tone was the driest she'd ever heard it. It is possible that he believed no copy of the original figures existed anywhere. Clara thought about her leather notebook, the one she'd been writing in for 3 years before she left, the one with the stitchwork patterns in the front and the household account figures in the back, recorded in the small, precise hand she'd taught herself because Nathaniel had once said her handwriting was childish. "He forgot about me," Clara said. He appears to have assumed you were not paying attention, Edmund said. Which was his error, not yours. October arrived with cooler air and the first color in the trees, and with it a letter from Evelyn that was longer than her previous ones and considerably more urgent. She wrote that Nathaniel had become suspicious of something she didn't know what specifically, whether he'd been contacted by someone, whether something had reached him through the merchant networks, or whether he simply had the instinct of a man who had operated in the dark long enough to feel when light was getting close. She wrote that he'd asked her twice in the past week where she'd stopped on the road to Clayfield and who she'd spoken to. She wrote that she'd told him nothing, but that she wasn't sure how much longer she could sustain that, and also that she was frightened in a way she wanted to name plainly rather than soften. Clara took the letter to Edmund the same afternoon she received it. He read it without expression. "How long before she's in physical danger from this?" he asked. It was not a comfortable question. Clara answered it honestly. "I don't know exactly. I know the pattern. When he feels cornered, he moves fast. Then we accelerate," Edmund said. He was already writing. "I'll contact the county clerk today. We can have the formal complaint filed by the end of the week, which gives us legal standing to act on Mrs. Blackwood's behalf before she has to make any public move herself." He looked up. "Once it's filed, it becomes official record, and there's no quiet version of this anymore. You understand what that means?" "It means the county finds out," Clara said. "The county, the commission, the merchants. He does business with the church he attends on Sundays, and the judge's wife," Edmund said. "All of it." Clara thought about the judge's wife telling her she was the most fortunate woman in the county. She thought about 6 years of Sunday mornings performing gratitude while her ribs ached. "File it," she said. The formal complaint was filed on a Friday. By Monday, Harrow County knew. Clara heard it first from Patience Fuller, who heard it from the dry goods merchant who had a brother-in-law on the county commission. Then, she heard it from Ada Marsh, who heard it from the woman at the market. Then, she heard it from Ruth, whose cousin, the one who'd left the Blackwood house in August, sent word that she was ready to add her own statement if it would help. "Tell her yes," Clara said. "Tell her Edmund Graves needs to hear from her directly." The information moved through the county like water through cracked ground, fast, unstoppable, finding every low place. Within a week, the picture being assembled in the public consciousness was not the picture Nathaniel Blackwood had spent 20 years constructing. It was the other one. The one that existed behind closed doors. The one that Clara and Evelyn and the doctor and the servants and the Richmond merchants' records had all been separately carrying, none of them knowing that the others were carrying the same weight. Nathaniel, from what Edmund heard through his colleague in Richmond, was furious. He sent a letter to Edmund's office that Edmund described as unwise in its specificity, meaning it contained threats that were themselves useful as evidence. He sent word to Clara's father, which resulted in Samuel Whitmore appearing at the workroom on a Tuesday morning for the first time since Clara had left Harrow County. She saw him through the window coming up the walk and felt the complicated machinery of daughterhood engage against her will. The old reflex of wanting him to be different than he was, the old hope that kept surviving past all evidence. She let herself feel it for the 5 seconds between seeing him and opening the door, and then she set it aside. "Father," she said. Samuel Whitmore was smaller than she remembered. Not physically, he was the same size he'd always been, but something had compressed in him, some quality of certainty that had always made him seem larger than his frame. He stood on the doorstep with his hat in his hands and looked at his daughter and said, "Clara, I'd like to talk." "Come in," she said. "I'll give you 10 minutes. I have work." She took him to the small office she'd set up at the back of the workroom, a desk, 2 chairs, the books, the order ledgers, and sat across from him the way she'd sat across from Edmund Graves, which was to say, present, clear, and not prepared to be managed. "Nathaniel contacted us," her father said. "I expected he would." "He's saying you've conspired against him, that you and Evelyn—" "We haven't conspired against anyone," Clara said. "We've told the truth. Those are different things." Samuel Whitmore looked at his hands. "He says he'll bring it all down." The business, your arrangement with Mrs. Fuller, your reputation. He can try. She kept her voice level. He's tried before. What he doesn't have this time is a compliant wife who's willing to absorb the damage quietly and ask the county's pardon for bothering them. Her father looked up. Clara, I'm not angry with you, she said, which was not entirely true and also not entirely false, and she said it because it was the most honest summary she could manage. I've spent a long time not being angry with you, which is different from not having felt it. What I need you to understand right now is that I'm not going to stop what I've started, and Nathaniel Blackwood trying to pressure me through you is not going to change that. Her father was quiet for a moment. You've changed, he said. I started changing the day I left, she said. You just haven't seen me since. Samuel Whitmore turned his hat in his hands. He was a man who'd spent his life calculating odds, and she could see him calculating now the odds of Nathaniel's threats being real versus the odds of his daughter having built something solid enough to withstand them. She could see him coming to the conclusion slowly, and not entirely comfortably, that his daughter's odds were better than he'd assumed. What can I do? He said finally. She looked at him. Tell the truth, she said. If anyone asks you about the debt you owe Nathaniel, tell the truth about how that debt was structured and what you understood it to mean when you encouraged me to return to that house. She held his gaze. That's all. I'm not asking you to be more than you are. I'm just asking you to be honest about what you know. He left after 12 minutes, not 10. Clara watched him go and sat for a moment in the quiet of the office, and then stood up and went back to work. James Calloway heard about it through the ordinary channels and came to the workroom that same week, not with an order and not with a pretext, just himself standing at the counter with his hat off and his expression carrying something she'd learned to read in him, a careful, considered concern that didn't perform itself. How are you doing? He asked. I'm fine, she said. Then, I'm managing. Those aren't the same thing. No, she agreed. They're not. He stayed for half an hour, which was appropriate, and he didn't ask her anything about the legal matter except to say once simply, you let me know if there's anything you need. He said it the way he said most things, without theater, without implication, just as a statement of fact about where he stood. She watched him leave, and felt something she'd been careful not to name too early settle a little more solidly into its shape. It wasn't urgency. It was the quieter thing, the growing certainty that some people, given time, turn out to be what they appear to be. That was, she was finding an extraordinary thing. The formal hearing was set for the second week of November. Edmund had worked through October with the efficiency of a man who'd been waiting for a case worth his full attention. He had Dr. Holt's written statement. He had the two former household servants both prepared to give testimony. He had Ruth's cousin. He had the Richmond merchant's ledger discrepancies laid against Clara's original household account figures. He had Evelyn's testimony, which Evelyn had given in a deposition that Edmund described as precise, consistent, and devastating. He had in total 7 years of documentation pointing in the same direction. Clara met with him the week before the hearing to go over what her own testimony would cover. She'd been a witness in legal proceedings twice in her life, once regarding a minor property dispute in her father's favor, once in a contract matter for Patience Fuller, and she understood the basic architecture of it. But this was different, and she knew it was different, and she sat in Edmund's office and let herself know it clearly before she tried to be composed about it. Tell me what to expect, she said. Nathaniel's counsel will argue that your testimony is motivated by personal animosity stemming from the dissolution of your marriage, Edmund said. They'll suggest that you've influenced Mrs. Blackwood, who was emotionally vulnerable, into making statements that serve your interests. And you'll counter with, 7 years of independent corroborating documentation, Edmund said with the closest thing to relish she'd ever heard in his voice. Your household account figures match the original merchant records with complete consistency. That's not personal animosity. That's arithmetic. What about Evelyn? They'll go hard at her. They will, Edmund agreed. But she's prepared. We've gone through it 3 times. She won't break." He paused. "She's steadier than you might expect." Clara thought about Evelyn in Ada Marsh's kitchen. Not the woman who'd arrived with the ring and the complicated expression, but the woman who'd sat across from Edmund Graves and talked for an hour and a half without flinching from any of it. "I know she is," Clara said. The night before the hearing, Clara sat at the desk in her office at the workroom after everyone else had gone home and looked at her leather notebook. She hadn't opened it in months. The information in it had been transferred to Edmund's care, transcribed and organized into the kind of document that mattered in a formal proceeding, and she hadn't needed to consult the original since. But she opened it now not for the figures, but for something else. She turned past the stitchwork patterns she'd been practicing in the evenings at Blackwood Estate, past the household account records, past the careful notes on Nathaniel's business transactions. She found the page she'd written on her first night at Ada Marsh's boarding house, the half page under the heading, "What I Know How to Do," and she read it. She read it slowly, all of it. Then she turned to a new page at the back and wrote the date. Below it she wrote in the same small, precise hand, "Tomorrow the county finds out what was inside that house. Whatever happens after it happened. It was real. I was there. I know what I survived, and I know what I built, and neither of those things requires anyone's permission to be true." She closed the notebook and put it in her coat pocket, the same coat, the same lining, though the cloth pouch of money was long since gone and spent. She went back to Ada Marsh's boarding house, and ate supper, and went to bed at a reasonable hour, and slept, which surprised her, but which was perhaps the result of having spent so long in preparation for this specific moment, that the moment arriving felt less like a cliff's edge and more like solid ground beneath her feet. The hearing was held at the Harrow County Courthouse, which meant Clara drove north for the first time since she'd walked south 3 years ago. She rode with Edmund in his carriage, which was more comfortable than she'd expected, and which Edmund used to review in his orderly way the sequence of the day. She listened and asked 2 questions, and spent the rest of the 2-hour drive looking out the window at the Virginia countryside going gold in November, and thinking about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of readiness. Harrow County looked exactly the same. That was the disorienting thing. She'd imagined without quite knowing she was imagining it, that the place she'd left would have changed in proportion to how much she'd changed, that the county that had watched her play the role of Nathaniel Blackwood's quiet wife would somehow look different now that the performance was over. But the roads were the same roads. The church steeple was the same steeple. The houses sat where they'd always sat, and the fields were the fields she'd looked at through windows for 6 years, and none of it registered any of the weight of what had happened inside it. That was fine. That was how places were. They held the shape of things, not the meaning. She stepped down from the carriage in front of the courthouse and straightened her coat and walked in. The courtroom was fuller than she'd expected. That was the first thing she registered, the number of people. Harrow County had turned out for this, which she should have anticipated, and hadn't entirely. She recognized faces, neighbors from the years at Blackwood Estate merchants' church families. The judge's wife in the 3rd row, with an expression that was working very hard to be neutral. She saw her mother in the back, which she hadn't expected, and the sight of Margaret Whitmore, sitting in the back row of a Harrow County courtroom, small, anxious present, did something to Clara's chest that she filed away for later. She saw Evelyn across the room. Evelyn was sitting with her own counsel, a lawyer from Richmond, that Edmund had helped identify, a woman named Mrs. Catherine Price, who was one of a very small number of female attorneys practicing in Virginia in 1819, and whose presence in a Harrow County courtroom had already generated its own secondary layer of murmuring. Evelyn was dressed simply, her hands folded in her lap, and she looked across the room and met Clara's eyes and held them for a moment. Clara gave her the smallest possible nod. Evelyn nodded back. Nathaniel Blackwood was at the front of the room with his counsel, a man named Foster from Richmond, who had expensive clothes and the kind of practiced confidence that came from winning cases in front of juries who trusted men with expensive clothes. Nathaniel himself looked composed. That was the word. The same composed performance she'd watched him give to the county for 20 years, the careful architecture of a respectable man. He did not look at Clara when she came in. That told her something. Edmund settled beside her at the table and opened his documents with the systematic efficiency she'd come to rely on. He did not say anything encouraging or preparatory, which was also something she'd come to rely on. He simply set out what needed to be set out and was ready when the proceedings began. The county judge, not the man whose wife had told Clara she was fortunate, but a younger man named Carroll, who had been appointed 2 years prior and who Edmund had described as fair and meticulous, called the hearing to order with the exact minimum of ceremony required. Foster opened on behalf of Nathaniel with the argument Edmund had predicted. Personal animosity, influenced testimony, a bitter former wife and her accomplice mounting a coordinated assault on an innocent man's reputation. He said, innocent man twice in the first 3 minutes, and malicious claims 4 times in the first 10, and he was good at it, the kind of good that came from considerable practice at convincing rooms full of people. Clara watched the room while he spoke. She watched the judge's wife's face, which was no longer working hard to be neutral, and had settled instead into something more complicated. She watched the neighbors and the merchants and the church families who had watched Nathaniel Blackwood be a respectable man for 20 years, and who were now, she could see it in them, doing the arithmetic that people do when they've trusted something for a long time, and something else has just suggested they shouldn't have. Then Edmund stood up. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice, which was one of the things she'd first noticed about him, and had come to understand as a deliberate choice rather than a natural inclination. He spoke in the same level, precise tone he used in his office, and he began with the Richmond merchant ledgers. He walked through the discrepancies line by line. He compared Nathaniel's current ledger to Clara's original household account figures. He produced the merchant's own records. He produced the testimony of both merchants who had submitted written statements that their records aligned with Clara's figures and not with the revised version of Nathaniel's ledger. He produced Edmund's own correspondence with Nathaniel's previous counsel, in which challenges to Clara's settlement had been withdrawn under conditions he was now in a position to explain clearly. And then he produced Dr. Holt. The doctor took 11 minutes to give his testimony, and the room got very quiet while he gave it. He spoke in the careful clinical language of a physician who understood the weight of what he was saying and had decided to say it anyway. He described the injuries he had treated. He described the explanations he had been given. He stated plainly and without visible emotion that the injuries were not consistent with the explanations. When Foster cross-examined him, Dr. Holt's answers did not change. Then, the 2 former household servants testified. Their accounts were specific, dated, and consistent with each other, which was exactly the kind of thing that mattered in a room where one side was arguing for a coordinated assault on an innocent man's reputation. Then Evelyn. Clara watched her stand up and walk to the position she'd been shown, and she watched Evelyn Blackwood tell the truth about what had happened inside that house in the plain, specific, unflinching language of a woman who had decided that she was done being the only one who knew. She did not cry. She did not perform. She answered every question Mrs. Price asked her, and every question Foster put to her in cross-examination, and she did not change her account, and did not soften it, and did not look away. Foster tried 3 different angles of attack, and all 3 of them failed, because the thing about the truth, consistently told, is that it has a texture that fabrication doesn't, and rooms full of people who have been trusting the wrong picture for 20 years can feel that texture when it's placed in their hands. Clara testified last. She walked to the position and stood there and looked at the room. The county. The judge Nathaniel Blackwood's composed face at the other table, and she answered Edmund's questions in exactly the order they'd arranged, and exactly the words they'd prepared, because preparation was not dishonesty, it was just the knowledge that important things deserve to be said well. She spoke about the household accounts. She spoke about the figures she'd recorded. She spoke about the conversations she'd noted in her leather notebook, and the dates, and the names, and the amounts, all of which were now part of Edmund's official documentation. She spoke about the first 3 years of her marriage in the specific, factual way that Edmund had coached her toward not asking the room to feel something, just asking it to look at what was in front of it. Foster's cross-examination lasted longer with her than it had with Evelyn. He tried the personal animosity angle. He tried the coordinated conspiracy angle. He tried a version of the argument that suggested Clara had been keeping unauthorized records of her husband's business for the purpose of eventual leverage, which was perhaps the most creative reframing of the wife was paying attention that Clara had ever heard. She answered every question with the same steady directness she'd been practicing her entire adult life, because the version of herself that had learned to stand still and be accurate in the middle of a storm had been built inside that marriage, and it turned out that skill was transferable. When Foster was done, she walked back to her seat. Edmund was already writing something. He slid it across the table to her without looking up. It read, "Good." Clara folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket next to the leather notebook and sat quietly while Judge Carroll took 30 minutes before rendering his findings. Nathaniel Blackwood lost. Not everything at once, these things moved in stages, and there were further proceedings to come, formal remedies to be determined, the Richmond ledger discrepancy to be referred to a separate inquiry. But the core of it was clear, and the room understood it, and the judge's voice was unambiguous when he delivered the findings. Clara watched Nathaniel's composed face fracture exactly once, a single moment, when the judge said the word fraud in connection with the ledger discrepancy, and something moved behind Nathaniel's eyes that was not quite what she'd expected. Not rage. Something worse than rage. Recognition. The look of a man who has built his entire life on the assumption that the people around him weren't paying attention, confronting the moment when he understands they were. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired and clear, and absolutely certain that she was in the right place. She found Evelyn outside afterward, standing in the November air with Mrs. Price beside her. Evelyn looked the way Clara had felt walking out of Blackwood Estate that July morning, emptied out and strangely light, the particular feeling of a weight removed that you've been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing its full measure. "You all right?" Clara asked. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said honestly. "Ask me in a few days." "Fair enough." Mrs. Price excused herself to speak with Edmund and Clara, and Evelyn stood together in front of the Harrow County Courthouse in a silence that was different from the silences between them before. Easier. More honest. "What happens now?" Evelyn asked. "Edmund says the Richmond inquiry will take a few months," Clara said. "The settlement, yours and mine, both should be protected. The rest takes time." Evelyn nodded. She looked at the courthouse door, then back at Clara. "Do you ever think about who we were before all of this?" "Sometimes," Clara said. "I think about us at 12 running in your mother's field." "God." Evelyn almost smiled. "We thought we had everything figured out." "We were 12, Clara said. "We were entitled to be wrong." A pause. November wind moved down the street carrying leaves and the smell of wood smoke. "I'm going to Clayfield for a while," Evelyn said. "My aunt says I can stay as long as I need. I have to figure out—" She gestured vaguely at the shape of what came next, the enormous undefined territory of a life that had to be rebuilt. "Everything." "You have time," Clara said. "You have more time than you think. And you're not starting from nothing. You're starting from the truth, which is a better place than most people get." Evelyn looked at her. "Is that what you were doing when you left?" "Yes," Clara said. And it turned out to be enough. Margaret Whitmore appeared at Clara's elbow. Then her mother, small and anxious, and looking at her daughter with the expression of a woman who has spent several months understanding something she should have understood long ago. "Clara," her mother said. Clara looked at her. The complicated machinery of daughterhood engaged again the same way it always did, with the same reflex and the same awareness that the reflex was not the same as a decision. "Walk with me, Mother," she said. They walked. Margaret Whitmore was not a woman who had ever been good at beginning difficult conversations. She'd spent her life letting the hard things circle overhead, like birds she hoped would land somewhere else, and Clara had grown up watching that particular evasion and recognizing it in herself on the days she was least proud of. But her mother surprised her, They'd walked half a block from the courthouse before Margaret said quietly, and without preamble, "I should have come to you. After you left. I should have come the first month." Clara kept walking. "Yes," she said. "You should have. Your father." "I know what father said," Clara said. "And I know what you chose. I'm not asking you to explain it, Mother. I just want you to know that I know the difference between what he said and what you decided." Margaret's breath came out unsteady. "I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of losing everything." Her mother's voice was small, but she didn't look away from the road ahead. "The house. The arrangement with Nathaniel. The stability such as it was. I know how that sounds." "It sounds like the truth," Clara said. "Which is better than I expected." They walked another half block in silence. "I saw what he was," Margaret said. "I saw it earlier than your father did. I just—" She stopped. "I told myself it wasn't as bad as I thought, that you were adjusting, that all marriages had difficulty." She pressed her lips together. "I told myself everything a person tells themselves when they don't want to act." Clara looked at her mother, really looked at her, at the woman who had cried happy tears in the church pew the day Clara married Nathaniel Blackwood, who had told her twice a year that the house was lovely, who had sat in the back row of a Harrow County courtroom on a November morning and watched her daughter tell the truth she'd been waiting 11 years for someone to say out loud. "You came today," Clara said. "Yes. That means something." Margaret looked at her with the eyes of a woman who was not sure she deserved that, and knew it. "Not enough," she said. "No," Clara agreed. "Not enough, but it's a start." She stopped walking and faced her mother on the cold November street. "I don't need an apology, Mother. I don't need you to feel worse than you already do. What I need from you, if you want to have a relationship with me going forward, is for you to see me as I actually am. Not as what my marriage made me look like. Not as the daughter who needs managing. Just me." Margaret Whitmore looked at her daughter for a long moment. Something shifted in her face, not dramatically, not the way transformations happen in stories, but the small and genuine way that real shifts happen quietly and without ceremony. "I see you," she said. "I do. It was not everything. It was not a guarantee of anything. But it was real, and real was what Clara had always needed more than perfection." "Come to Millhaven," Clara said. "Come see the workroom. Come meet the women I work with." She started walking again. "Come see what I built." The Richmond Inquiry finished in February of 1820. Edmund sent word by courier, which meant the news arrived on a Saturday morning while Clara was in the workroom reviewing a commission for a family in the county seat who wanted 12 embroidered panels for a dining room renovation. She read the letter standing at the work table while Ruth and Dora watched her with the focused attention of people who had been waiting for this news alongside her. She set the letter down. "He's been found liable for the ledger fraud," she said. "The Richmond merchants are filing a separate civil claim for the amounts misrepresented. The county commission removed him from his seat last week." She paused. "Edmund says Blackwood Estate is likely to be sold to satisfy the judgments. He says to expect it to take another 6 months to work through completely." The workroom was quiet for a moment. Then Bess, who was now 19 and had been with Clara almost from the beginning, said "good" in the flat, emphatic way that meant exactly what it sounded like, nothing more elaborate needed. "Good," Ruth agreed. Dora said nothing, but set her needle down and pressed both hands flat on the table, the way she did when something landed that was too large for words and too important not to mark somehow. Clara folded the letter and put it with her other correspondence. She picked up her own work. She went back to the commission. She did not need the workroom to be a celebration. What she needed it to be was what it was, a room full of women working, which was its own kind of answer to everything that had happened inside that house, 30 miles north. Nathaniel Blackwood did not disappear quietly. She'd known he wouldn't. A man like that, a man who had built 20 years of a county's trust and believed it permanent, doesn't dismantle without making noise. He wrote letters to Edmund that Edmund forwarded to her with brief notations of their legal relevance, which was none. He made statements to people in Harrow County that were reported back to her through the usual channel statements about Clara's character, about Evelyn's instability, about the coordinated nature of the conspiracy against him. The statements did not land the way they once would have. That was the thing about truth that Nathaniel Blackwood had apparently never properly understood. Once enough people saw it clearly, the alternative version became very difficult to reestablish. He'd spent 20 years building a particular picture of himself, and the hearing had not just challenged that picture, it had replaced it, and the new picture was the one that had always been the real one, and you cannot unknow what you've seen clearly. He's saying things about you again. James Calloway told her one Sunday in March, not with alarm, but with the careful directness he used when he thought she needed information rather than management. "I know," Clara said. "People aren't listening." "I know that too." James looked at her with the steady level look she'd come to know well over 8 months of Sundays. "Does it bother you that he's still—" "It bothers me the way weather bothers me," Clara said. "I notice it. I make appropriate preparations. I don't let it determine what I do next." He was quiet for a moment. "That might be the most Clara Whitmore thing you've ever said to me." She looked at him. "Is that a complaint?" "No, ma'am," he said with the particular soft emphasis that meant the opposite of a complaint. "It's genuinely not." She let herself smile, which she was getting better at the full kind, without calculation. "Chapeau." The question of what she and James Calloway were to each other had been organizing itself slowly and honestly over the 8 months since that first Sunday walk, which was exactly the pace it needed to move. She had not rushed it. He had not pushed it. They had let it be what it was. Two people who had each survived the wreckage of a life they hadn't chosen, finding their way toward something they were choosing deliberately and with open eyes. He'd met Ada Marsh in November, and the two of them had taken to each other with the immediate comfortable ease of people who recognized a similar quality of groundedness. Ada had told Clara afterward in the kitchen that James Calloway was the kind of man who knew what he didn't know, which Ada considered the most useful quality in a person. He'd met Patience Fuller in December, and the two of them had argued pleasantly about tobacco prices for 40 minutes, which Patience Fuller later described as one of the better conversations she'd had recently. High praise from a woman who had strong opinions about what constituted a good conversation. In January, he'd brought Anna to the workroom. Anna was 7 years old, serious as a judge with her father's level gaze and her own very clear opinions about everything she encountered. She had examined the workroom with the focused attention of someone conducting a professional evaluation. Asked Clara 3 specific questions about how the embroidery frames worked, and informed her that she herself preferred horses, but that sewing seemed useful. "It is useful," Clara said gravely. "Do you like it or just do it?" Anna asked. Clara thought about that. "Both," she said. "Which is the best combination?" Anna considered this, and apparently found it satisfactory because she sat down next to Bess and watched the stitching with complete concentration for the next hour, and asked 4 more questions, and accepted a small piece of practice linen to take home. James, watching all of this from the corner, had the expression of a man watching something go well and being careful not to say so too loudly in case it spooked the moment. Clara caught his eye across the room and held it for just long enough to let him know she'd seen it too. He asked her in April. Not dramatically, not in the way that proposals were made in the stories that got told at church socials with poetry or theatrical gestures or public declaration. He asked her on a Sunday afternoon in the ordinary way he did most things, sitting across from her at the small table in Ada Marsh's kitchen, where they'd taken to having coffee when the weather wasn't right for walking. "I want to marry you," he said. "I've known it for a while, and I figured I should stop carrying it around by myself and just say it out loud." Clara looked at him. "You've known for a while?" "Yes." "How long is a while?" "Approximately since December," he said. Which felt too soon to say out loud in December, so I waited. She put her coffee cup down and looked at him carefully, the same looking, Carefully, she'd done at every stage of this the practice she'd developed of not talking herself into or out of anything before she'd actually looked at what was in front of her. What was in front of her was James Calloway, who had shown up consistently for 8 months without drama or pressure, who had listened more than he'd spoken, who had met her mother and her lawyer and her business partner and her workroom full of women and treated all of them with the same uncomplicated respect, who had a daughter who asked good questions, and a farm that he managed with the steady practical attention of a man who took his responsibilities seriously without performing them, who had never not once made her feel like she was a problem to be managed, or a position to be filled, or a woman who needed to be smaller than she was. She thought about 19 years old, and a church social, and a man who had deployed his smile with military precision. She thought about September of 1811, and the tightness in her chest that she'd told herself was nerves. She thought about 6 years of learning the geography of another person's moods, and she thought about what she'd told her mother, just me. She looked at James Calloway, and she knew not with the naive certainty of 19, but with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who had survived enough to know the difference between what looked like safety and what actually was, that she was not afraid. That was its own kind of answer. "I'm not the same person I would have been," she said, "if none of this had happened. I need you to know that going in." "I know that," he said. "I'm not looking for the person you would have been. I'm asking the person you are. I have a business that I intend to keep running. I know that too. And opinions," she said, "about most things. Clara." His voice was very patient. "I've been listening to your opinions for 8 months, and I'm sitting here asking you to marry me, so I think we can take that one as established." She looked at him for one more moment, letting herself be certain, letting the certainty be what it was. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding longer than the conversation itself, which told her something about the gap between his composure and what had been happening underneath it, and which she found unexpectedly very dear. "Thank you," he said. "You're thanking me." "Yes, I was prepared for several other outcomes." "Such as?" "Several other outcomes," he said firmly, which made her laugh, a real laugh, the full kind, and it came easily in the way that real things do when they've been earned. Ada Marsh cried when they told her. She denied it immediately and completely, and with such conviction that Clara and James both let it go without comment, which was the only dignified response available. Patience Fuller said finally, and went back to her ledger, which was the most Patience Fuller response possible. Bess made a noise that the workroom collectively agreed not to formally acknowledge. Ruth said, "Good man," which was the highest compliment Ruth extended to anyone, and which James, when Clara told him, seemed to genuinely appreciate. Anna, when her father told her, was quiet for a long moment in the serious way she had. Then she said, "Does that mean she's going to be at our house sometimes?" "Yes," James said. "Can she bring the frames?" "The embroidery frames. The ones she showed me. I want to learn the proper way." James looked at his daughter and then at the ceiling briefly. "I'll ask her," he said. Anna nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to whatever she'd been doing, and James came to the workroom the next afternoon to report this exchange with the expression of a man who has been thoroughly outmaneuvered by a 7-year-old and is choosing to view this positively. Clara sent Anna home with 2 frames and a set of threads in good colors, with a note that said, "Come to the workroom on Saturday and I'll show you the first stitch." Anna came on Saturday and stayed 4 hours and learned 3 stitches and asked 12 questions and told Clara solemnly at the end that she thought she might like sewing after all, in addition to horses, because a person could like more than one thing. "Yes," Clara said, "they can." The last of the Blackwood legal proceedings concluded in June of 1820. Edmund sent the final summary in a letter that was 3 pages long, and contained figures and legal citations that Clara read carefully once, for comprehension, and then set aside. The essential facts were, these Nathaniel Blackwood had been found liable for financial fraud in the matter of the Richmond merchant contracts. Blackwood Estate had been sold in a forced proceeding to satisfy the civil judgments. Nathaniel had relocated to Kentucky. Edmund had heard, though he hadn't confirmed it, and was no longer in Harrow County. Clara's settlement was protected and paid in full. So was Evelyn's. She read that part twice. She wrote back to Edmund, "Thank you for everything. Send me your final invoice and it will be paid within the week. I hope the next 8 years of legal work are somewhat more dramatic, since you clearly have an appetite for it." Edmund wrote back, "Considerably less dramatic, I hope. My nerves are not what they were. Congratulations on your forthcoming marriage, Mrs. Whitmore." She folded the letter and put it with the others. She'd kept the one from the county clerk that had started the whole proceeding, the one from Evelyn from Clayfield, the note from Edmund that had read simply, "Good." She kept them in the back of the leather notebook, which had long since run out of blank pages, and had been joined by 2 additional notebooks in the same style, all 3 of them now full of the accumulated record of what she'd built. Evelyn wrote in July. She'd been in Clayfield for 8 months by then, and her letters had shifted over that time, from the careful stripped-down communication of a woman in survival mode to something more like herself, or more like the self she was becoming, which was not entirely the Evelyn Carter who had grown up barefoot in summer fields, but was someone who had that woman somewhere inside her and was slowly finding her way back to her. She'd been working with her aunt who ran a small millinery business. She wrote discovering that she had more practical capacity than she'd been allowed to develop, which she described with a wry honesty that Clara recognized as a good sign. "I think about what you did," she wrote, "how you built it. I'm trying to understand it well enough to do something like it eventually. Not the same thing. Something mine. I don't know the shape of it yet, but I'm beginning to think there is a shape." Clara wrote back, "There is always a shape. You find it by doing the next right thing and then the one after that. You don't need to see the whole thing from the beginning. I didn't." Also, she wrote, "You were always more capable than you believed. I knew that when we were 12. Some things don't change." She sealed the letter and posted it and thought about Evelyn in Clayfield finding the shape of something new, and felt something she'd been careful not to feel too directly until this moment. The particular gladness of knowing that someone you loved had gotten out and was going to be all right. Not because of anything Clara had done, because Evelyn had chosen to tell the truth and then lived past the telling. That was the only way it ever worked. She married James Calloway on a Saturday in September of 1829, years almost to the week after she'd married Nathaniel Blackwood on a cool blue morning that she'd told herself was a beginning. It was a beginning. It had just not been the beginning she'd understood it to be at the time. This beginning she understood. She wore her own dress, not her grandmother's lace, which had spent 9 years folded in a cedar chest, and which she'd finally given to a woman in the workroom who'd asked about it, and who'd looked at it the way Clara had once looked at it, with the particular longing of a young woman who believed the thing she was about to step into was going to be everything it appeared. She'd let her have it without ceremony or explanation. She hoped the lace brought her better luck than it had the first time around, and she suspected it might, because luck of the particular kind Clara had discovered was not a fixed resource, but a thing you made slowly with your own hands. Ada Marsh stood beside her. Patience Fuller sat in the front row and did not cry, not even briefly, and maintained that position throughout. Ruth and Dora and Bess and the others from the workroom came and filled half the seats and constituted the most important audience Clara could have asked for. Anna stood beside her father in the serious way she stood everywhere, wearing a dress she'd told her father's housekeeper she did not need help with putting on, which had resulted in one back button being in the wrong buttonhole, which no one mentioned. Margaret Whitmore sat 2 rows back with Samuel beside her. Her mother had visited the workroom in February, as Clara had asked, and had sat quietly for an hour watching the women work, and had said at the end, "You did this," in a voice that contained everything she'd been unable to say directly. Samuel had come in the spring awkwardly and without any great ceremony, and had looked at the order books and the contracts and the correspondence with the county seat families, and had not said what he'd expected or what he'd been wrong about. but had shaken Clara's hand in the way of a man who was making a kind of acknowledgement he didn't have the language for. It was not what she'd always wanted from her father. It was what he actually had to offer. She'd decided at some point in that spring that she was done waiting for people to be more than they were, and that what they actually were honestly and without performance was enough to work with. James Calloway looked at her when she came to stand beside him, the way he always looked at her, level present, completely without strategy. Like she was a fact of his life that he had decided to be glad about and intended to stay glad about, and that was all there was to say about it. She stood beside him and said the words, different words than 9 years ago. A simpler ceremony. No church hall full of the county's social machinery, and meant every one of them in the specific way she'd been unable to mean anything at 19 before she'd known herself well enough to make a promise that was truly hers to give. Afterward, James's neighbor, a farmer named Hatch, who played the fiddle at every occasion, whether he'd been asked to or not, started playing something lively on the porch, and Bess grabbed Dora's hand and pulled her into the yard, and Anna appeared at Clara's elbow and said, "Will you dance?" with the solemn directness that was entirely her own. "I will," Clara said. She took Anna's hand, and they danced in the September afternoon. The woman who had walked 14 miles on a July morning with a carpet bag and $112 sewn into her coat lining, and the girl who liked horses and sewing and asking exactly the right question at exactly the right moment. The fiddle played, and the afternoon went gold and warm, and the women from the workroom laughed at something Bess said. And Ada Marsh sat in a chair on the porch with a glass of cider and looked at all of it with the satisfaction of someone watching things be exactly what they should be. But 3 years later, when people in Millhaven described what Clara Calloway had built, they reached for different words depending on who they were. The merchant families said she ran the finest embroidery operation in the county, which was accurate as far as it went. Patience Fuller, who was 68 now, and had handed over the last of the day-to-day management, and spent her afternoons mostly reading, which she claimed was retirement, and which everyone else recognized as exactly what Patience Fuller had always done. Only now, without guilt, said she'd backed the right investment, which was also accurate, and also more than that. Bess, who was 23 and running quality oversight, and had just told Clara she wanted to eventually open her own operation in Clayfield, said, "You showed me that the ceiling wasn't where they put it," which was perhaps the most precise description available. The workroom had 10 women by 1823, a waiting list of 3. 2 apprentices who'd already completed their training and moved on to positions elsewhere in the county, taking their wage history and their skills with them into lives that were by every measure Clara cared about more possible than they'd been before. Evelyn wrote from Clayfield, where she'd opened a small millinery shop the previous year, to say that she had her first profitable quarter, and that she'd hired a woman named Grace, who reminded her a little of Clara at 25, which she meant entirely as a compliment, and which Clara took as one. Anna Calloway was 10 years old, and could do 6 different embroidery stitches with genuine proficiency, and had informed Clara that she planned to learn the rest, but was also going to ride horses professionally when she grew up, and that she saw no reason both things couldn't be true. Clara agreed with her completely. James was beside her in the particular way that people who have chosen each other deliberately and with open eyes tend to stay beside each other, not dramatically, not performing the fact of it, just present and consistent and glad. He asked her opinion on things and listened to the answers. He disagreed with her sometimes and said so directly. He made her laugh regularly, which she'd discovered was one of the finest things a person could do for another person, and which she had not had enough of in her life before him. She told him that once on a winter evening with Anna asleep and the house quiet. "You make me laugh more than anyone," she said. "I didn't know I'd missed it until you started doing it." He looked at her with that level expression. "I'll take that as the highest possible compliment." "It is," she said. She went back to Blackwood Estate once. Not to the house. The house was under new ownership by 1822, bought by a family named Hendricks from Philadelphia, who knew nothing of its history beyond the price of the land. She didn't go to the house. She went to the road that ran along the south edge of the property, the road she'd walked out on with her carpet bag on that July morning in 1817. She didn't go alone. James was beside her and Anna was walking ahead of them, having been promised a look at the Hendricks family's horses, which were apparently remarkable. Clara stood on the road and looked at the property for a few minutes. The fields were the same fields. The ridge was the same ridge. Everything looked the same as it had looked for 9 years before she'd left and the 3 years after she'd gone. James stood beside her without speaking, the way he understood when speech wasn't what was needed. She thought about the woman who had stood at the kitchen window watching a July morning and knowing with the cold clarity that lives below everything else that something had to change. She thought about the carpet bag and the coat and the $112 and the leather notebook. She thought about 14 miles of dirt road and a farmer named Gideon Pruitt, who asked if she needed a ride. She thought about Ada Marsh and Edmund Graves and Patience Fuller and Ruth and Bess and all the women who had sat at the work table and discovered that the ceiling wasn't where they'd been told. She thought about Evelyn in Clayfield Profitable Quarter Grace, who reminded her of Clara at 25. She thought about Anna ahead of them, on the road walking with the purposeful stride of a girl who'd already decided that she was allowed to want more than one thing. She looked at the property for a long time. Then she turned away from it. "All right," she said. James offered his arm without comment, and she took it, and they walked up the road to where Anna was already in conversation with a stable hand about the horses, because Anna was 10 years old and had already learned that the best way to get what you wanted was to walk directly toward it and ask. Clara had taken considerably longer to learn that. She was glad she'd learned it anyway. The road north was the same road it had always been. She walked it in the October afternoon with her husband beside her and her stepdaughter's voice carrying back to them on the wind, and she thought, "This is what I built. This is what survived. This is what it looks like when a woman stops waiting to be rescued and rescues herself instead." Not the ending anyone had predicted for her. Not the story the county had expected when Nathaniel Blackwood had looked across a church hall at a 19-year-old girl and decided she was the right kind of manageable. Her story. Written in her own hand in the same small, precise script she'd taught herself, because someone had told her the first version was childish. She'd kept writing anyway. That was, she had come to understand, the only thing that had ever really mattered. A woman's worth was never measured by who she married or what she survived or how gracefully she endured. It was measured as best Clara Whitmore Calloway could determine after 31 years of living by what she chose to build on the morning after the worst thing happened. And what Clara had built was this: a room full of women working a daughter, asking the right questions, a husband who listened a friend, finding her shape in Clayfield, a mother learning to see a leather notebook with 3 volumes and every page full. And herself, entirely, finally, irrevocably, herself walking a Virginia road in October with her whole life ahead of her, belonging to no one, owing nothing, free.